Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. This is a screencast-o-matic presentation and recording for the part of the lesson that has looking at a reading from Upfront Scholastic on the Battle Over the Census. Before we get started, please let me encourage you to open up to today's lesson, scroll down the correct section, and get ready to answer the key concept questions that coincide with the reading. Please remember that you can replay any part of this presentation for detail, clarity, or repetition later on. Let's go ahead and get started. The Battle Over the Census. The decision to add a question about citizenship on the 2020 census has prompted a massive fight over the once-a-decade national count. The question seems simple enough at first glance. Are you a citizen? But that question, which the Trump administration wants to add to the 2020 census, has caused an enormous uproar. 19 states, a number of cities, and a variety of immigrant groups have filed 6 separate lawsuits to block the question from appearing on the once-a-decade national head count that will be conducted next year. Those who oppose the citizenship question say that it will be so intimidating to immigrants, both legal and undocumented ones, that many will skip responding to the census altogether, and that, they say, could lead to a wildly inaccurate count with massive repercussions for the nation. What the Trump administration is requesting is not just alarming, it is an unconstitutional attempt to discourage an accurate census count, says Xavier Becerra, Attorney General for California, one of the states suing to have the citizenship question removed. The Trump administration, in announcing the addition of the citizenship question last spring, said it needs the data to better enable the Department of Justice to enforce voting laws. Having a more accurate count of citizens nationwide, officials say, would help them calculate the number of people eligible to vote in each state. I would think it's a very reasonable thing, then Attorney General Jeff Sessions told Congress last April, and I think concerns over it are overblown. The administration also points out that a citizenship question was routinely part of the census through 1950. President Trump tweeted recently that the census would be meaningless without the all-important citizenship question. The United States Census is more than just a count of the nation's population. It's a snapshot of America that determines everything from how many seats in Congress each state gets to how federal money is distributed, and whether a new H&M opens near your house. It all goes back to the Constitution, which requires the federal government to count the nation's residents every 10 years. It's been faithfully doing so since 1790. That first year, 650 census workers were instructed to track down every living person in the original 13 states. In 2020, the Census Bureau expects to hire 350,000 people to go door to door to interview those who don't send back the questionnaires that are mailed to every address in the nation. In their quest to tally every last person, census workers have been known to use snowmobiles to get to remote Alaskan villages and lobster boats to reach distant islands off the coast of Maine. The Constitution calls for a count of all citizens and non-citizens living in the U.S. in order to redistribute the 435 seats in the House of Representatives, which are allocated based on population. Places with expanding population gain representatives, and those declining populations actually lose them. The Founding Fathers wanted everyone to participate, whether you were a citizen or not, says Robert Groves, provost of Georgetown University and a former director for the Census Bureau. Suing the government. This year, a number of states and advocacy groups are worried that the addition of the citizenship question might put that goal of universal participation at risk. So worried, in fact, that they took legal action soon after the citizenship question was announced, accusing Trump administration officials of violating the constitutional requirement to count everyone. The largest of the lawsuits, in which the 18-plus states, the District of Columbia, and some cities and advocacy groups are suing the Trump administration for, notes that the Census Bureau has warned for decades that questioning residents about their immigration status or citizenship would, quote, inevitably jeopardize the overall accuracy of the population count. Over the last 6 months, federal judges in New York, California, and Maryland have ruled against allowing the citizenship question, and the Trump administration has appealed to the Supreme Court. Last month, the justices heard arguments in the New York case, and the ruling is expected to be heard before summer, when the printing of the census forms is scheduled to begin. Fears among immigrants. How will these legal proceedings shake out to have an enormous impact? A little more than half the nation's 44.5 million immigrants are not U.S. citizens. Of those non-citizens, a little more than half have visas or green cards that allow them to reside in the U.S. legally, and about 11 million of them are undocumented. But demographers worry that any U.S. household with at least one person who's not a citizen will be less likely to participate in the census because of fears of deportation, even though the census doesn't identify individual respondents. Overall, 14% of the U.S. residents live in households that include one or more people who aren't citizens. That figure rises sharply if you look at specific minority groups. Almost half of Hispanics and Asians, 46% and 45% respectively, live in households with at least one non-citizen. This year, the lawsuit says immigrants' fears over the census have been heightened. Those concerns have been amplified by the anti-immigrant policies, actions, and rhetoric targeting immigrant communities from President Trump and this administration, the lawsuit says. President Trump has made a crackdown on illegal immigration the centerpiece of his presidency. The fight over Trump's plan to build a wall on the border with Mexico prompted a shutdown of the federal government in December. Trump has stepped up arrests and deportations of undocumented immigrants. He's drastically reduced the number of refugees allowed in the country, and he's proposed tighter restrictions on legal immigration. The policies, Trump says, are aimed at keeping Americans safe and protecting U.S. jobs. Because immigrants are concentrated in large states like New York and California, the effect of undercounting them would be to dilute the power of the country's most populous states, says William Frey, a demographer at the Brookings Institution, a liberal think tank in Washington, D.C. If 50% of the non-citizens go uncounted, that would be enough to cost California and New York one congressional seat and one electoral vote each, to the likely benefit of Colorado and Montana, Frey says. Democrats say what's really going on is an attempt by Republicans to increase their power by fudging the numbers. This is a brazen attempt by the Trump administration to cheat on the census, to undermine the accuracy of the census, and to attack states that have large immigrant populations. States, most of which just happen to be Democratic states, says Congressman Jared Nadler, Democrat in New York. Is Alabama being robbed? Republicans dismiss the complaints as nonsense. We always are better off having a more accurate account of citizens versus non-citizens, Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, who's also chairman of the Republican Attorneys General Association, told the Associated Press. I see no downside in this. While Democratic-controlled states and pro-immigrant groups are trying to squash the citizenship question, the state of Alabama, which is under Republican control, is taking a very different tack. It has filed a lawsuit against the Commerce Department, which oversees the Census Bureau, seeking to block the census from counting undocumented immigrants at all. The lawsuit says that including undocumented immigrants in population totals used to apportion congressional seats inappropriately increases the representation of states with large immigrant populations, a practice robbing Alabama residents of their rightful share of political representation. Congressional seats should be apportioned based on the population of American citizens, not illegal aliens, says Congressional Mo Brooks, Republican of Alabama. But Frey, the Brookings demographer, maintains that there's another way to look at the census. Whether people are citizens or not, and whether they're illegally or not, he says they're part of our communities and they're using our roads, schools, and hospitals, and they need to be counted so resources are allocated fairly. Ultimately, he argues, the census isn't a zero-sum game in which one group gains if another group loses. For example, the long-term economic health in older white Americans depends on, he says, on a robust U.S. economy, but the economy won't be as strong as it could be if young people who are increasingly minorities or the children of immigrants haven't gotten the resources they need to succeed. Forcing an inaccurate accounting of who resides in the nation, says Frey, will have a long-term negative consequence for everyone. The Supreme Court will ultimately decide which arguments win out, but despite all the controversy over the 2020 census, some still hope that the national headcount will turn out to be a unifying force to some extent. The census is the only event in the country where everyone is asked to participate, says Groves, the former Census Bureau director. Elections are for those who are eligible to vote. Not everyone goes to schools. The census is unique. So there you guys have it. That is the story of the U.S. Census currently as we speak, and the situation, of course, regarding this controversial but yet consequential change. Only time will tell what the census actually will look like for decades moving forward and how that will impact voting districts accordingly. Thank you very much for tuning in, and good luck with completing the rest of the lesson.